Rainy season of 1942, as black clouds still swirled over the skies of Java and the rumble of gunfire had just subsided. The tropical jungles of the Dutch East Indies still bore the scars of battles past. Beneath the moisture-laden canopy and the scent of decaying earth lay a colossal steel shadow, motionless like a lost creature. A B-17E. Flying fortress forced to land, its body riddled with shellfire, yet still exuding the majestic presence of a steel bird from across the Pacific. Around it, Japanese soldiers scattered like shadows, wary yet curious, for even those who had fought in the skies over China rarely stood near a fully intact American machine like this. In the chaotic early days of the Southeast Asian campaign, the Japanese had captured many spoils of war, but a complete B-17 was a rarity, a wartime gift, more precious than gold, offering a glimpse into the heart of American industry. In the dim light, filtering through the trees, the flying fortress appeared as a fallen monument, its nose pockmarked, cockpit glass cracked in two, the left wing grazing the ground and leaving a long streak of mud. Yet it was precisely this damage that made it terrifying, like a wounded warrior radiating the dignified aura of a weapon that the entire Pacific had feared. Japanese soldiers approached, fingertips brushing the corrugated aluminum structure, starkly different from the thin, fragile metal of their own aircraft. They tapped each panel, hollow but solid, unlike any metal they were accustomed to. An officer bent down to examine the intact landing gear, murmuring, "So sturdy." Unbelievable, those whispered words, initially mere astonishment, soon turned to awe when they opened the bomb bay and saw a labyrinth of wiring, electrical systems, and hydraulics, all orderly to perfection. This was no work of a handful of craftsmen. This was the product of an industry they had never imagined. When news of the captured fortress reached Japanese headquarters, the top engineers from the Geiken Institute were immediately ordered to Java. They crossed the sea, armed with rulers, calipers, blueprints, and the silence of those who knew this mission was more than intelligence gathering. It was a confrontation between two visions of national power. Upon arrival, the jungle was still damped from the night's rain, but before them was not tropical beauty, but a dark metal mass lying motionless, like a mechanical god frozen in time. They stood around it for a long while, as if facing a being from another world. Starting at the nose, they opened each panel. Every piece fit perfectly, every piece numbered. No sign of hand-cut edges, no misaligned seams, no rough joins that they had come to accept as standard in their own production lines. Each sheet of metal seemed cast from the same enormous master mold. The Japanese engineers exchanged glances, a mix of confusion and anxiety, realizing that such uniformity could not be achieved by human hands alone, however skilled. Only machines' massive hydraulic presses, advanced steel, rolling lines, welding, casting, and stamping techniques they did not yet possess could produce a complete metal creature like this. The first day passed in tense silence. They measured the thickness of aluminum sheets, the width of rivet lines, the gaps between panels. Yet by day's end, instead of finding enemy weaknesses, they felt as though they were staring into a world for which they held no key. The youngest engineer, who had worked at a Mitsubishi factory, whispered, "If we wanted to replicate this, it would take 10 years, maybe more." No one replied, for everyone knew it was true. But the discovery had only begun. The next day, when they opened the engine compartment, their eyes lit up and then darkened immediately. Before them lay the Reiter 1820, the 9-cylinder heart of the fortress. They removed each fastener, pulled out each component, and each time, a hard truth became clear. Every part was interchangeable without adjustment. Piston tolerances, cylinder smoothness, bearing uniformity, all far exceeded Japanese standards at the time. An older engineer stood silently for a moment, then said in a quiet, cutting voice, "They don't need skilled hands. They just need machines." His words sounded like a death knell for Japan's pride in craftsmanship-based production. Then came the electrical systems. As they traced bundles of wires secured with identical metal clips, their spirits sank. Here was something they had never considered. Modularity, the ability to swap and replace components like assembling Lego blocks. The oxygen system adjusted automatically for altitude. The hydraulic system color-coded. The instrument panels removable with just a few standard screws. Every detail was designed for wartime attrition. Hundreds of aircraft consumed weekly, with parts easily replaced without elaborate calculations. In contrast, each Japanese plane was subtly unique, like hand-painted artwork. Beautiful, fragile, and impossible to mustache produce. As the sun began to set, the jungle bathed in golden-orange light, the scent of resin mingling with hot metal. The Japanese engineers sat around the B-17 like ancient scholars reading the sacred texts of a lost civilization. They spoke little, merely flipping through pages of meticulous measurements and notes. But the numbers could not convey the full truth. What they felt most acutely was the distance between a nation striving to dominate the skies through artisan skill and a nation unleashing an industrial flood. Its machinery capable of replacing an entire generation of craftsmen. Night fell. The dirt road leading out of the jungle vanished into darkness. The Japanese engineers departed, carrying thick notebooks and a heavy sense of defeat. Behind them, the flying fortress lay silent, having completed its second mission, not bombing, but illuminating for the enemy the true strength of America. And in the dark of the Java jungle, no one heard the faint sigh of the older engineer, whose entire career had led him to a single, stark truth. We did not lose in the sky. We lost in the factories. When the 3 captured B-17s were brought to Japan, the atmosphere in Gaiken's research workshops suddenly changed. Curtains were drawn tighter. Guards stood straighter. And the veteran engineers, the masters of Japanese aviation, appeared with rare tension etched on their faces. They understood that this was not just a technical dissection. It was an opportunity to peer into the lifeblood of the American empire. But they did not know that what awaited them behind those aluminum panels would forever change the way they saw the world. From the very first hours. As the first B-17 was rolled into the spacious hangar, the fluorescent lights above casted in a glow as if illuminating a colossal statue. They had never seen an aerodynamic structure assembled with such intricate precision. When they opened the cabin and removed the metal flooring, layers of the supporting frame appeared like the skeleton of a steel monster, joined with near-perfect accuracy. And when they compared their findings across the 3 different B-17s, they were stunned. They realized that all the panels were identical in size. The rivet lines were positioned to within fractions of a millimeter. The wing ribs were stamped so uniformly that, if factory labels and country of origin were hidden, no one could tell which factory or even which aircraft they came from. All 3 planes, one from the Philippines, one from Java, one from the Bismarck Sea, seemed born from a single, fixed design, unalterable, even by a fraction of an inch. A Japanese engineer, who'd spent his life building zero fuselages, could only mutter, "This is not the work of human hands. This is the work of machines." Those words haunted them for months. Afterward, at the time, Japan prided itself on craftsmanship. Workers who spent their lives in workshops could shape a panel with a wooden mallet and an eye trained by generations, bend wing frames by feel and accumulated experience. But when faced with the flying fortress, confront a harsh truth. Skill, no matter how great, could not compete with standardization. A skilled craftsman could produce a masterpiece, but America could produce 10,000 masterpieces identical to each other. Then came the second phase of their examination. The engines stopped when they removed the right R-1820 from its mount. The hangar fell silent. They took off cylinder heads, pulled pistons, opened crankshafts, and weighed each component on precision scales. As the results came in, a chill ran down their spines. The tolerances of each piston were nearly identical. The weights of the connecting rods differed by mere thousands. Bearings, bushings, lock nut sole were astonishingly uniform. Another Japanese engineer, who had designed Nakajima engines, could only bend over the table and sigh. They manufacture this like they manufacture screws. But the horror came from another revelation. They fitted parts from B-17, one into the engine of B-17 number 2, No adjustments, no filing, no fine-tuning, as they would with Japanese aircraft. And the engine fit perfectly. Each component meshed so smoothly, it was as if made for one another. A young engineer nearby could hardly believe his eyes, repeating over and over, "No adjustment. Nothing needs adjusting." In Japan, that was impossible. Every aircraft, every engine was an individual, marked by the hands of its maker. A piston from one engine could not replace that of another without a skilled craftsman fitting it. But for America, that was not philosophy, it was a standard. And that standard allowed them to produce tens of thousands of engines each year, each identical, like letters printed from the same press. What truly made the Japanese engineers realize they faced an unbalanced fight was the electrical and hydraulic systems. Opening the panels, they saw hundreds of wire connectors, each control panel marked with power ratings, serial numbers, factory of origin, and most strikingly all identical across the three B-17SA switches were the same. Gauges identical, even the wiring insulation met the same hit resistance standards. An electrical engineer gently touched a wire cover and quickly understood. "We cannot make this. We do not have this material." In a corner, an older engineer disassembled the hydraulic assemblies. He examined the pumps, inspected every valve, analyzed every pipe. Everything was threaded to a single standard. A precise number of turns ensured a perfect fit. In his lifetime, he had never seen such uniformity. Japanese hydraulic systems at the time were a patchwork of 2 generations of standards, products from multiple factories, inconsistent and improvised. In America, everything was standardized, not because they were skilled, but because they could enforce that skill through machines and production lines. After weeks of disassembly, measurement, and comparison, the Japanese engineers reached a conclusion they did not dare to write, but all acknowledged in their hearts. "We cannot catch up," one exclaimed in despair. "Even if we copy their blueprints, we cannot make this. We lack the machines. We lack the materials. We lack the production lines." They were no longer comparing aircraft. They were comparing 2 worlds. One, a craft-based, intricate, but fragmented industry. The other, a mechanized, automated, standardized industry capable of replacing an army of craftsmen with push-button machines. And the most terrifying realization, America did not just have the capability to build one B-17 like this. They, build 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. In numbers too vast for war to diminish. Japan could shoot down 1, but America would produce 10 more in just a few days. It was at that moment the Japanese engineers realized they faced an enemy not only powerful in the skies, but also in factories deep within America places. They had never seen, but could feel, through every rivet, every piston, every wire of the flying fortress. And on a cold October afternoon in 1942, as they closed the thick report books like sacred texts of a new religion, they all looked at the motionless B-17. No one spoke. Yet, in their eyes fear and reverence merged, for they were not just looking at an airplane, they were looking at America's true strength. A power not in bombs or bullets, but in the ability to produce them at a scale the enemy could scarcely imagine. In that moment, the Japanese engineers were no longer mere engineers. They had become unwilling witnesses to a wartime truth. The master of the skies is not the best pilot, but the one who can produce the most steelbirds. In mid-1943, as the obsession over the captured B-17s still weighed heavily in Gaiken's meeting rooms, the Japanese Air Force Command made a bold decision so audacious that even many generals were cautious. Not only would they dissect the fortresses on land, but they would do something unprecedented, fly one of them over Japanese skies. Not for combat, but to gain a deeper understanding of its mechanisms, performance, and the strengths and weaknesses only revealed in real flight. This mission would be so secret that even veteran pilots were not allowed to know it existed. The B-17 chosen was the most intact, no warped fuselage, no cracked wings, landing gear fully functional. For weeks, it was hauled into a secluded hangar, guarded around the clock, while engineers in long white coats moved around it like priests, performing rites around a sacred relic. Engines were fitted with new spark plugs. Oil was filtered. Wiring reconnected. Japan had no genuine spare parts. Yet strangely, many improvised replacements still functioned when installed in the American engines. It was as if the aircraft had been born to accept anything within its standardized framework, a trait that weighed heavily on the Japanese engineers, reminding them of what they lacked, the very conditions that allowed America to produce tens of thousands of such planes. On the first test flight, the hangar was cleared. Only the chief engineers, a few top-secret commanding officers, and to test pilots a military and a civilian were permitted inside. On the runway, the B-17 rested, like a sleeping giant among far smaller Japanese fighters. As the engineers started the engines, the roar of the four Reiter 1820 engines thundered simultaneously, forcing many to instinctively step back. The propellers spun violently, kicking up dust-like for awakening locomotives. The co-pilots, who had flown nearly every type of Japanese aircraft, slid into the right seat, running his hands across the controls, then froze. He had never seen a cockpit so densely packed with gauges, switches, and panels, yet so intuitively arranged. English markings, international symbols. Standardized Control Z was like reading the language of another civilization. ST, Fortress, rolled down the runway and gained speed. The ground beneath everyone trembled. Compared to light, agile Japanese planes like the Zero or Q-43, the B-17 was a massive, imposing beast. Yet when it lifted off, all the weight vanished. It rose slowly, steadily, not flying in the traditional sense, but climbing the sky with sheer power and authority. When it reached the skies over Kanagawa, an unspoken truth became undeniable. They were witnessing the machine America used to carry war across the entire Pacific. At 3,000 meters, the B-17 maneuvered with even smoother reactions than many Japanese aircraft. Despite being twice as heavy, what stunned them most was its stability. The aircraft vibrated minimally, maintaining perfect balance even against strong sea winds. The test pilot said over the radio, his voice trembling, "It feels like flying a dancing elephant." On the ground, Japanese generals observed through binoculars. Some frowned, others clenched their fists, but all understood the stability did not come from the pilot, it came from the dense steel framework and honeycomb structure held together by hundreds of thousands of rivets. It was so strong that some engineers believed the aircraft could continue flying for hours, even if an engine failed. Some whispered, no wonder it survived the bombing raids in Europe. But the secret flights did not stop at one. Oberte. Following months, the B-17 Kodinam won by the Japanese undertook more than 20 test flights. They measured speed, fuel consumption, stability under imbalance, vibration resistance when hit, takeoffs against headwinds, landings on short runways, and even the effect of shutting down two engines on the same side. Each time, it demonstrated incredible durability. One of the most shocking tests involved firing 20mm shells at the metal panels from a distance to simulate anti-aircraft fire. The aluminum was punctured, but the wing and fuselage structure did not twist. Its load-bearing frame is like elephant bones. One engineer remarked, if that were our Ki-49, it would have snapped in half. Yet what haunted them most was not strength or resilience, it was survivability. A test pilot reported that, even with both left engines completely shut down, the B-17 could still maintain straight flight and altitude. For Japanese planes, this was impossible. These secret flights deepened the engineers' sense of despair. They were not merely observing a powerful aircraft. They were seeing the mindset behind it, a production philosophy that maximized stability and safety. The B-17 was built not just to win individual battles, but to continue its mission even while severely damaged, a philosophy completely opposite to Japan, where each aircraft was a fragile, razor-sharp sword, deadly but easily broken. Once, after one landed from a longer-than-expected flight, a Japanese engineer stepped into the cockpit, hand trembling as he touched the controls. He looked at the rows of gauges. Still perfectly functioning. Listened to the engines cooling and exclaimed, "This is not just a plane. It's a mobile factory." An officer standing nearby replied gravely, "And America can build 1,000 more like this." In long nights when reports were written in tiny script to avoid leaks, many engineers wondered if America could build a B-17 this strong and could produce it faster than Japan could study it. What did the war really mean? These secret flights, known only to the highest technical circles, became an unspeakable nightmare. For each time the B-17 took off and returned safely, it revealed the truth they had tried to avoid. Japan did not lose because pilots were weak, not because weapons were inferior. They lost because they fought in the age of steel with the mindset of the age of wood dotting over Japanese skies where the B-17 had never imagined flying. These flights became a prophecy of the war's outcome. Whoever masters production will master the skies.
In the gray winter of 1944, as a cold northern wind swept over Tokyo's curved rooftops, the Japanese Empire lulled itself with the belief that the Americans, no matter how strong, were merely loud barbarians lacking refinement, lacking Bushido spirit, lacking the endurance to carry on through suffering to the very end. Navy broadcasters persistently proclaimed that Japan might face shortages of food, steel, and aluminum, but the divine spirit of Yamato would compensate for all. And the people gaunt men in factories, women with white towels tied across their foreheads, children drawing down American aircraft believed it as if it were a divine truth. Yet far above, beyond the reach of loudspeakers, reality was rewriting itself with a cold pen of truth. The clouds over eastern Tokyo were constantly torn apart by the roar of massive engines, not the sporadic light bombers that had appeared before, but the breath of a war machine fueled by a substance Japan could only dream of, 150-octane gasoline, flowing continuously from America's catalyst cracking plants stretching across the continent. Every gallon was a declaration that war was not only determined by courage, but by science, industry, and the ability to turn a nation into a massive forge. At first, the Japanese General Staff assumed these American sorties were mere temporary displays. But reports from air defense units began to pour in, each page soaked with the sweat of officers trying to remain calm. They wrote that the speed of American aircraft seemed to increase months by months. That P-51 Mustangs suddenly climbed to altitudes Zeros could not follow. That American pilots, rather than faltering in sharp maneuvers as before, now moved with a terrifying smoothness, all thanks to a fuel Japan could not produce. This truth was like a slow, relentless knife cutting through pride nurtured over generations. In secret meeting rooms, gray-haired officers stared at one another in silence. They did not speak, but all understood. Efforts to synthesize fuel from colon boasted as a symbol of Japanese scientific prowess could produce only a weak gasoline. Utterly incapable of helping the Zero compete with an enemy growing faster, stronger, and flying farther with each passing month. Then reports came from Manchuria. Fuel trains repeatedly bombed. Small depots burned to the ground. Artificially synthesized gasoline, painstakingly produced through thousands of chemical reactions, reduced to smoking puddles. Japan, already scarce, now entered the true darkness of logistical warfare. While America shipped high-octane fuel by the barrel like sacks of rice, Japan had to ration every liter, distributing it to pilots like precious medicine. At forward airfields, young Imperial Navy pilots finally felt the truth more clearly than any propaganda paper could convey. Sitting in the cockpit of a Zero, adjusting sights and testing controls, they realized their Nakajima engines strained as if a gaunt horse were forced to pull an overburdened cart. The planes no longer carried the confidence of early war days. Meanwhile, the Mustang's new adversaries in Japanese skies roared with vitality like predatory beasts. One Japanese pilot, in a diary found after the war, wrote, "We do not lose because of courage. We lose because the enemy has wings of steel, while we have only wings of dreams." Those on the ground began to understand as well. Each time the air raid sirens sounded, they looked up at the night sky torn apart by anti-aircraft fire, only to see B-29s gliding with casual dominance like flying fortresses, each carrying the power of an entire industrial backbone. And within each of these machines, hundreds of gallons of 150-octane fuel burned brightly, generating unstoppable thrust. Japan, long convinced of its divine will, now faced a weapon that willpower alone could not defeat: the truce. A truce as cold as steel, as heavy as the roar of American engines overhead. America was strong not merely in numbers, but because it had turned science into strategy, crude oil into swords, and catalytic cracking technology into the pulse of an entire war machine. And when the nights of Tokyo flared with the first bombings, the people began to grasp what the generals had long known but dared not say. The war was not only fought in the skies, but in oil refineries half a world away. In the cracking towers where crude oil was split into perfect molecules to produce a fuel Japan could never create. The balance of war had already tipped long before the first bombs fell, and in that moment, amid smoke, screams, and chaos, the Japanese finally faced the painful truth they had long avoided. America did not merely bring war. They brought a new era that Japan no longer had the strength to follow.
When the war had receded, when the skies over the Pacific were no longer stained with black smoke and the roar of engines had become a faint memory, people began to look back at the lesser-told pieces of the greatest confrontation of the century. And among those pieces was a quiet story, sharp as a hidden blade. The story of the American planes that were cupped to red alive, flying fortresses of steel that fell onto Japanese soil in the chaotic early years, before the United States had fully revealed the power of its industrial might. These were the wayward B-17s, the wounded B-24s crews forced into emergency landings on enemy territory. To Japan, these aircraft were not just scrap metal, they were assets. Lessons. Mirrors reflecting the enemy they faced daily in the skies. In secret hangars at Takikawa and Mitaka, Japanese engineers who had never seen an industry as advanced. As Americas carefully disassembled each metal panel, measured every cable, recorded every complex mechanism of the hydraulic systems, and then reassembled everything as if reconstructing the skeleton of a steel beast. They were astonished. They were awed, and at times they despaired, because what they saw inside a B-17 was more than engineering. It was a mindset. A mindset Japan did not possess, where Japanese planes were designed with the philosophy of light to be agile. Americans chose thick to survive. Where Japan scrimped on every gram of aluminum, Americans encased their machines in steel so thick that Japanese engineers would ask one another, how did they do this, and by what means? The secret tests began. Japanese. Officers flew the repainted fortresses, taking off in foggy mornings to avoid American reconnaissance. They pushed them into the wind, climbed high, dove steeply, and were horrified to recognize the difference. Some pilots wrote in classified reports, if America had deployed these planes in the Pacific from the start, the war would have ended sooner. But one thing shocked them even more: the fuel those fortresses required to unleash their full power. when the Japanese tried feeding synthesized coal fuel into Pratt and Whitney, all right, cyclone engines. The machines roared angrily, shook violently, and then died like a famished beast. Only when they accessed a small supply of high-grade fuel taken from captured American reserves in the Philippines did they understand this was not fuel Japan could ever produce. Not with current technology. Not with the resources they had. Not in a country so short of oil that ethanol had to be mixed into combat gasoline. And from those captured planes, a truth rang out like the toll of a fateful bell. This war could not be prolonged in the way Japan had hoped. Many years after the war, when historians reopened those secret files, they called the captured B-17s and B-24s by a weighty name. Unwilling teachers, for they taught Japan that the world had changed, that the era in which courage and spirit could compensate for industry was over, that a nation wishing to fight had to possess both knowledge and steel, both fuel and intellect to surplus that America had in abundance. Japan realized this too late, but that belated lesson became the foundation for what came after the war. The meteoric rise of Japan's economy. Engineers who once disassembled flying fortresses now headed research institutes. Those who had meticulously recorded the hydraulic systems of B-24s now designed automobiles. Students who had been curious about alloys in American engines went on to create products that amazed the world. Ironically, the legacy of the captured flying fortresses did not lie in war. It lay in peace. It lay in the powerful innovation that transformed Japan from a depleted nation into a technological powerhouse. As someone once said, those planes did not save Japan in war, but they helped save Japan in peace. And so, amid the ashes of a fallen empire, amid lessons written in blood, the planes that had fallen on enemy soil continued to live not in metal, but in the final lessons they left for both sides. America looked back and saw that its advantage lay not just in weapons, but in boundless creativity. Japan looked back and understood that only by mastering knowledge could it step out of the shadow of war. Decades later, when B-17s and B-24s existed only as museum exhibits, the story of the captured flying fortresses endured as witnesses to an era when knowledge became the detonator that determined the fate of a nation. A legacy not forged in the sound of bombs, but in truth. A legacy not resounding on the battlefield, but in the factories of the future. A legacy proving that sometimes a war does not end when the guns fall silent, but when the final lesson is understood.